Cheney was behind it, and so was Benny Thompson and everybody on that committee. For what they did, honestly, they should go to jail.
So you think Liz Cheney should go to jail?
For what they did.
Everyone on the committee, you think
I think everybody anybody that voted in favor.
Are you going to direct your FBI director and your attorney general to send them to jail?
No, not at all. I think that they'll have to look at that.
They'll have to look at it. It's no mystery what Donald Trump thinks about the January 6th committee and its members. He's been about as clear as you can get that once in office, he and his handpicked loyalists in the Department of Justice will do whatever they can to go after them. The Biden administration, in its remaining days, is reportedly taking that threat quite seriously, as they consider preemptive pardons for those on Trump's exhaustive enemies list, including the two people that Trump explicitly named in that interview, the chair and the vice chair of the January 6th committee, Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney. Earlier today, President Biden awarded both Thompson and Cheney, along with 18 other Americans, the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of the country's highest civilian honors. Both Cheney and Thompson received enormous and extended standing ovations from what are normally reserved crowds in the East Room. Afterwards, the president gave brief remarks to open the ceremony.
I quote, "Grave perils are yet to be encountered in the stormy course of a republic, but there's no reason we should fear them or doubt our capacity to overcome them. If we each endeavor to live so as to deserve the high praise of being called a good American citizen."
Alexi McCammon is a political analyst and host of the In Sync with Alexi podcast. Jennifer Horner is a former chair of the New Hampshire Republican Party, and they join me now. Alexi, it was interesting to me today that Benny Thompson had this to say. There's been sort of some parlor game talk about the possibility of preemptive pardons, as well as, reporting on that. Thompson says that he would take a Biden pardon after Trump has threatened to jail him. And I wonder what you think about how real this is and what it would mean.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's time that Democrats should start taking Donald Trump's threats seriously. And especially now that he has been reelected president, there is nothing really stopping him from doing exactly what he wants. He has repeatedly proven that he doesn't take the attacks of January 6th seriously, and that he doesn't believe in the outcome of the 2020 election. So I think issuing these preemptive pardons would mean that Democrats are abiding by reality, facts, trying to uphold democracy in some way, and trying to really, I feel like, keep standards together in some respect by not allowing Trump and his folks to go after people like Liz Cheney, Adam Schiff, Benny Thompson because of political enemies or political disagreements.
Jennifer, what do you think about the sort of choice to do this ceremony today to award this honor both to Cheney and Thompson, obviously not happening in a vacuum, a kind of clear symbolic message being sent here?
Yeah, well, there's no question this is sending a message about how President Biden feels about January 6th and about the threats being made against people who tried to hold the criminals involved in that day accountable. We all have to remember a couple of things. Some of the craziest things that Donald Trump has ever said, he actually acted on, number one. Number two, he refers to the Department of Justice as his DOJ. He sees every agency in government, especially the DOJ, as a tool that belongs to him as president to use as he pleases. His extreme narcissism needs someone to be held legally at fault for the accusations made against him. This has been such a great burden to him, to his mentality, to his stability. He has not accepted the truth, the outcome of the January 6th committee. He knows what the truth is, but he refuses to acknowledge it publicly. And I think that this is very serious. This is a very serious thing. And they're talking about Thompson and Cheney right now, but you should expect that list to grow significantly. Adam Kinzinger, if I were him, he should be concerned. And let's not forget, there were an awful lot of Republicans out there campaigning, vigorously against Donald Trump in this last cycle. So I would take this very, very seriously.
You know, something that I think has happened a little bit as you watch some Democrats and people in the sort of political opposition figure out what their posture is this time around, how to orient them, is this idea that, well, you know, we ran on the January 6th thing and the preservation of democracy didn't work, so what are you going to do? This kind of like, let's just not talk about it again. And I personally think that's a mistake, both politically and substantively, Alexi, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's completely out of touch with reality. I don't know how they go from calling the guy a fascist and outlining point by point his threats to democracy and all of the crazy things he has said and the violence and political violence that has been behind a lot of the rhetoric that he has spoken, his allies have spoken, and then the election happens and it's sort of like, oh, never mind, we were just kidding about that. We're going to go talk to him and allow him to be president. Democrats should have like a 100-day plan for the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency about what Democrats around the country can do to push back against, you know, expected things that Project 2025 will do, Trump and his allies will do. They should be continuing to talk about the existential threats that are actually much more real now, arguably, than they were during the campaign. And so it is mind-blowing, and it makes Democrats seem like they're not telling the truth when they don't continue keeping up with this narrative and really the facts of what is happening and who is coming back into office.
Yeah, that's a good point about it. If you sort of abandon it after Election Day, then it seems like you're retroactively disingenuous when, in fact, what you were saying was true, which is it not working politically is true to a certain extent. You have to deal with that. But I also think there is political, you know, if Democrats think they can leave this in the past, Jennifer, Trump is not going to let them. I think this is a really key thing for everyone to understand. They're not going to let it go. Like, he's going to issue pardons, I think. They're going to go after these people. It's not like if the Democrats just say truce on January 6th, truce on the fact that you tried to bring down the constitutional republic, that he will then move on.
There's no such thing as a truce for Donald Trump. We all know that. The grudges that he holds are deep and everlasting. And he will do everything possible to get back at anyone that he thinks has hurt him or undermined him in many ways. And when it comes to the Democrats and how they're looking at this now, this cannot be something that you look at and say, well, we tried it as a campaign strategy and it didn't work, so we need to abandon ship on it. That is the worst thing that they could possibly do. This is not just, you know, the Democrats are the only people with any sort of influence out there who are going to have the ability to continue to go after the goal of preserving democracy in this country. The Republicans have abandoned that ship. So they can't look at this as just some political strategy that didn't work. They've got to rise above, and they've got to be that voice and that leadership that rises above and sets the example for the American people and continue this battle. I'm very concerned that they won't.
Yeah, and the last point I make here is that I think they have public opinion on their side, honestly, when it comes to these things. I mean, anyone with a lick of political sense is constantly telling Trump to move on from January 6th. If you're counseling, you're saying, don't pardon all the people in jail. That stuff is not going to be popular, and it's important for Democrats to sort of recognize they have the wind at their back on that. Alexi McCammon and Jennifer Horn, thank you both.
Thanks.
Still ahead, the latest chaotic Republican attempt to elect a Speaker of the House. We're doing this again. Mike Johnson has the majority, but will he be able to hold on to the top job? Not sure. That's next. Donald Trump is about to face his first big political test of the new year. He waits to see if House Republicans will follow his order, basically, and re-elect Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House tomorrow. Now, normally, this would be a fairly straightforward process, but it's the Republican Party we're talking about. There are a lot of disgruntled members of the House, a lot of stuff bubbling under the surface, and a very narrow majority. At least one Republican Congressman, Thomas Massey, says he will not vote for Johnson, saying he's not equipped to be Speaker. A handful of other Republicans say they are still undecided. Now, it may all go smoothly and Johnson wins, but given the level of dysfunction we've seen from this caucus, it also could all go horribly wrong for Johnson and Trump tomorrow, which wouldn't be anything new. Remember, it famously took 15 rounds of votes to get Johnson's predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, elected Speaker 2 years ago. And he was ousted less than a year later, and then it took another 3 weeks of Republican infighting before they finally gave Mike Johnson the job. The speaker election gets underway around noon tomorrow. If Johnson doesn't get the votes, it won't just be a humiliation for his backer, Donald Trump. It could also delay the official certification of Trump's election victory on January 6th. Saul Kapoor is the senior national political reporter for NBC News, and he joins me now. All right, set the scene of the whip count here, right? My understanding is as of tomorrow, there will be 219 Republicans and 215 Democrats. Is that right?
You are correct, Chris. As we talk here tonight, this speaker race is too close to call. Mike Johnson will have 219 Republican members tomorrow, and he will need 218. It's not enough to simply have more votes than the next guy. It's clear that there's not going to be a Democratic speaker, but he needs an outright majority of all members voting and present. So if all of the 219 Republicans and all the 215 Democrats show up, Johnson can only afford one defection. He already has one obvious defection, as you just mentioned, Tom Massey. He doesn't have a second hard no yet, but there are a number of members who are not committed yet to Mike Johnson. These are familiar Republicans, members of the Hard Right Freedom Caucus. Our team has been staking out Mike Johnson's office all day, saw several of them walk into his office. Clearly, they're having conversations and negotiations. It's a little bit like Kevin McCarthy early in 2023, but there's one crucial difference. These members are not attacking Mike Johnson frontally, and they know they're about to head into a Republican trifecta where this actually matters. This is not a situation where Joe Biden is still president and they're going to be passing messaging bills. This is their time to govern, and if they can't elect a speaker, they can't do anything. That is the argument that Mike Johnson is making, pleading with his members. Get this done quickly. Don't drag it out so they can get to work on Trump's agenda.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, this usually, for folks that have watched this before, it's usually a foregone conclusion, the way these leadership works. Even if it's close, that there's essentially there have been internal leadership elections that had sort of sorted things out beforehand, and and one party votes for its leader, the other party votes for its leader, and you win outright, and then you become the speaker.
It usually works that way, Chris, but I would never expect anything to go quite so smoothly in this House Republican conference, especially with the margins this narrow. Even smaller margins than the last 2 years when Republicans really struggled to govern. And remember, getting elected speaker is going to be the easy part for Mike Johnson. What comes next is going to be much tougher. They've got another March 14th deadline to fund the government. They're going to need to cut a deal with Democrats there. They have a mid-year, sometime in the middle of the year, a deadline to extend the debt limit, which is something that Republicans hate to do. And at the same time, they have to juggle, confirming Trump's nominees through the Senate and pass major party line bills on immigration, on energy, on tax cuts, extending the Trump tax cuts, all with this tiny majority that, Chris, it's going to grow even smaller. Matt Gaetz is not going to take his seat tomorrow. That's 219. Michael Waltz and Elise Stefanik are leaving to join the Trump administration. That means a 217 to 215 margin in the crucial early months of Trump's presidency. That is a 0-vote margin. A single defection means a bill cannot pass with Democratic votes. So one way or another, exciting times ahead for this House Republican conference.
So, right, just to remember the math. So Walz is not, he's going to the National Security Council, right, which is not Senate confirmed, if I'm not mistaken. That's just a White House position. So I don't think he needs Senate confirmation. Stefanik is going to be nominated to be Ambassador UN. That will require Senate confirmation. But should she be confirmed, then you go down to 2-7, 215, pending those special elections, which could take a month, right? That window is really crucial. So even if they, manage to just lose one vote tomorrow, he becomes speaker, you're now in a position where, again, this weird position we've seen before with this House Republican caucus, any individual, you basically need full consensus across 217. It's like being in a meeting room where 217 people all have to agree to the same thing.
It could take several months, Chris, before they're back to that full strength of 220 seats. And yes, any one of these Republicans could be basically a Joe Manchin of the House Republican Conference. They can single-handedly take down bills. Now, for the most part, they have, what some Republicans are calling a super whip in President-elect Donald Trump. He can be very influential, and he has endorsed Mike Johnson. His, pressure points, his endorsements are not everything, but they do count for a lot. There are still some members of this conference, though, who don't take orders from Donald Trump. Tom Massey is one of them. Chip Roy is another one of them, the Texas Republican congressman who endorsed Ron DeSantis. He's been a target of Trump's ire in the past and has not really flinched. He's a true believer in a lot of, conservative causes, including things like cutting the deficit and red ink and cutting spending, which Trump doesn't really care so much about. So the fact that the margins are this small means Donald Trump alone can't have the kind of super influence that he tends to have.
Yeah, and we should remind everyone that Donald Trump issued directives during the showdown we had a few weeks ago. He said, get rid of this debt ceiling thing, and it didn't work, and they ignored him. So, Sahil Kapoor, thank you very much for your reporting. Appreciate it. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We are starting to get a clearer picture about two New Year's Day attacks, one in New Orleans and Las Vegas, although there's still a whole bunch of unanswered questions. These acts of violence on the eve of a second Trump administration are also a sobering reminder about just how high the stakes are of who administers the American government in a whole bunch of ways, both in the technical aspects of how the tens of thousands of government workers whose job it is to protect American citizens, how they function, who they answer to, what their directives are, how good they are at their job, as well as what our leaders, including the leader at the top, do and say in the aftermath of an attack like this. In New Orleans, 14 people are dead and more than 30 others injured after a man identified as Samsudin Jabbar drove a rented truck into a group of revelers on New Orleans' famous Bourbon Street, where he was killed in a shootout with police. Surveillance cameras captured the disturbing moment that Jabbar approached Bourbon Street, suddenly veering around a police car that was there to block people from entering and driving through a crowd of folks. Samsudin Jabbar was a U.S. citizen, born and raised in Texas. In fact, he previously served in the Army, including a tour in Afghanistan, before being honorably discharged as a staff sergeant in 2020 and apparently becoming radicalized in the intervening years. According to the FBI, Jabbar was 100% inspired by ISIS and wanted headlines from the attack to focus on the, quote, war between the believers and the disbelievers. The truck he used for that mayhem had an ISIS flag mounted to it in the back, and the FBI is investigating the incident as an act of terror. Jabbar had weapons in the trunk as well as an improvised explosive device. Tonight, officials released these surveillance pictures showing Jabbar an hour before the attack in the French Quarter. They say he was planting other IEDs in coolers, two of which have been disarmed. And now, to be clear here, and this is important, contrary to what law enforcement had said yesterday, it is now believed that Jabbar indeed acted alone.
We do not assess at this point that anyone else involved in this attack is involved in this attack except for Shamsuddin Jabbar, the subject you've already been briefed on.
Meanwhile, in Nevada, authorities have identified 37-year-old Matthew Allen Livelsberger as the man who detonated a Tesla Cybertruck outside the Trump International Hotel Las Vegas, injuring several bystanders. The source of the explosion is still not entirely clear at this hour, although it appears to involve mortars and consumer-grade fireworks. Police say Livelsberger rented the Cybertruck in Colorado on December 28th, using the same peer-to-peer rental service that Jabbar used in Texas. He then drove the truck to Las Vegas, parked at the Trump Hotel valet just before 9 a.m. on New Year's Day. Truck exploded 17 seconds later. Police initially believed that Livelsberger died in the explosion, but now believe he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound before the detonation. Livelsberger was an active-duty master sergeant in the elite special forces and a candidate for the Green Berets. He served in the Army for 18 years with deployments in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Tajikistan, and the Republic of Congo. Today, President Biden said he and Vice President Harris were briefed on both attacks, along with his Homeland Security team, and stressed that federal law enforcement agencies are being given all the resources they require to prevent future attacks. In brief remarks to the press, the president also stated that despite the similarities between the two attacks and the attackers, there is no indication they are related at this time.
We're also continuing to investigate whether or not there's any connection between the New Orleans attack and the explosion in Las Vegas. As of now, they've just been briefed. They have not found any evidence of such a connection thus far. I've directed them to keep looking. The individual who rented the truck that exploded in Las Vegas also served as active duty U.S. Army.
Julia Ainsley is the NBC News Homeland Security correspondent, has been covering the attack in New Orleans, and she joins me now. Julia, we were on the air yesterday, obviously, covering this. It does seem like some of the information about the motivation or the trajectory of the attacker here has been filled in that time. What have we learned?
Yeah, that's true. And Chris, also since yesterday, as you pointed out, when we thought that there could be multiple people involved in this plot, that's changed too. That just goes to show the importance of careful reporting, not just by the media, but also by investigators, and how incredibly chaotic things like this can be in the immediate aftermath. So as we're putting together more pieces, we're learning that Jabbar acted alone, that those people who were seen on surveillance videos were really seen to be walking by what were coolers with IEDs placed in them. We're learning more about that timeline. We understand that Jabbar placed those IEDs as improvised explosive devices in the coolers at 1:46 a.m., another at 2 a.m., and then had another one in the car with him. We also understand from investigators that they haven't seen anything like this really since the Tsarnaev brothers at the Boston Marathon bombing, that these were seen as something with a lot of power, that he put nails inside, and he had a way to detonate through a remote control, almost something you can put together by deconstructing a toy, Chris. We're also learning more about his travel. We understand now that he traveled to Egypt in 2023 and to Canada. All the trips, any international trips are being looked at by investigators. They want to figure out how he came to be radicalized. Another thing we learned today from that press conference is that Jabbar himself said in a social media post that he was radicalized before this summer, which means his radicalization, or he may not have considered that radicalized, but his turning point to ISIS was before this summer, which could mean it was some point during this year. But the motives here are actually clearer at this point than they have been in other attacks, in part because he had that ISIS flag tied onto the truck that did so much damage, and because investigators were able to get into his home in Houston and get out electronic devices and go through them. They were able to get 2 laptops. They're looking at his social media. There's a clear path of motive here. Another thing he said that was chilling, that we learned from investigators today at that press conference, is that he thought about harming his own family, but he decided that the headlines wouldn't read as someone who was out there to fight who he called the disbelievers. And so he decided to go after this attack instead. That's very surprising, considering a lot of the family members who have been interviewed either by the media or by investigators said they never saw this coming, Chris. So those are more details that we learned just today about this man, and whatever point he decided to carry out this horrific attack is still unclear. We also, one thing to add is he did go to a gun store in Houston on December 30th on his way to carry out this attack.
Just to sort of zoom in on one aspect here, and I don't think this is definitive in either direction, but we have had, and you and I have both covered, a large number of attacks that were essentially inspired by fealty to ISIS, but not operationally connected to them in any way. They were essentially lone wolf attacks. They were undertaken by an individual who just did it, for the cause. It seems at this point, the best we know, that's what category this is in, though obviously that's not definitive. Is that your understanding from your reporting today?
Absolutely. Not definitive. I mean, there's a reason why they're still going to go through his phones. They said that today. They want to see anyone who might have been in contact with him. But yes, this is bringing us back to, when I first started covering DHS around 2013, 2014, you think about San Bernardino, you think about what happened in the nightclub shooting in Florida. People who were inspired by ISIS. We're opening up that playbook again, Chris. We're not necessarily looking at a directive from someone within a hierarchy in ISIS. And so that seems to be what we're looking at now. But of course, investigators still have to continue their research and figure out who he may have been in touch with.
And of course, there are dozens of people still injured, and there are folks in hospitals right now. Our thoughts are with them. We have 14 families that are mourning someone right now. Julia Ainsley, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Joining me now, Ryan Riley, justice reporter for NBC News, who has been closely following the attack in Las Vegas. That's, of course, the other one that happened on New Year's Day. And Ryan, I got to say, I was the biography definitely was striking to me of the individual who has been identified as a person in that truck, not just a veteran, not just a service member, but active duty on leave, actually, as best I understand. Is that right?
That's indeed right. Yeah, and from a Defense Department official, we know that apparently he had a child several months ago, and that confirms what a lot of the online sleuths had told me when they were looking into this individual. You see some of the photos on Facebook. I believe those were posted by his ex-wife several years ago. He did a lot of traveling, and that's what we sort of know. But really, the picture that we have really only lasts up until, it's a few years old. We need to see what exactly was more recent and why this all came about. There's the one photo of him that was actually taken in Thailand, and that's one I found on his TripAdvisor account, and that was because he went to a martial arts program and claimed he got pink eye there. So that's the image you might have seen. I think it was shown at the top of the show, where he has, those really red eyes. So that was what was going on there. But he's very well traveled. He's got, this TripAdvisor account that came up through this facial recognition match, and then obviously, it seems as though he was trying to send a message, but we really don't know a ton at this point about what inspired it at this point, what the breaking point was. But when you blow up a Tesla in front of the Trump building in Las Vegas, there's obviously some pretty over-the-top political implications to that. But we have to figure out where the facts lead about what he was actually trying to do here and whether there was a breaking point or what it was.
Yeah, clearly this, as best we know, right, this was intentional spectacle created by this individual. He appears to have succumbed to a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but in the case of New Orleans with the ISIS flag and then subsequent investigation, fairly legible and recognizable motive that we've seen in other attacks. This one, right? We still just don't really know what this was about.
We don't, and I think that we don't really know a lot, but I think that one thing that we've seen a lot of, and this came up in connection to January 6th. In fact, when all of this happened yesterday, I was just thinking, well, this is the most vulnerable period for the United States of America, because frankly, that's when maybe not everyone's firing on all cylinders, and a lot of people are on vacation, within the federal government, within the FBI, in those lead-ups, and that's exactly what happened on January 6th. Of course, I should say we don't know if there were any failures here yet, if there were any missed tips, but that is a common theme that we've seen in FBI investigation after FBI investigation, because they get hundreds of thousands of tips. It's really tough to sort through which ones are garbage, which ones they actually need to follow up on. And so there's just an overwhelming amount of information, and it remains to be seen whether or not either of these people were at all on sort of the FBI's radar before this, whether there were anything that could have been done previously, as we've seen in many cases before, including with Dylan Roof, for example. It's happened over and over and over again where the FBI has had information on someone, but because there were so many tips and because there were so many people to chase down, they didn't get around to doing anything about it.
Yeah, we should also note, of course, that there may be no legible motivation in the end. One of the worst mass shootings in American history happening in Las Vegas a number of years ago, there was no distinct motivation that ever really emerged from that. We may just end up in that situation. Again, Ryan Riley, who's been reporting on this all day for us, thank you so much for your time tonight. I think we've all come to expect, sadly, that in the midst of some disaster or some terrible attack, Donald Trump will be chomping at the bit to unleash lies and the worst kind of bigotry. And we saw this before in Trump's first term. First as farce, when he famously drew in Sharpie on a hurricane map to make it look like his erroneous warning about where the hurricane would hit was actually correct. Remember that one? And then as tragedy, when in the midst of his disastrous response to a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that killed over 1 million Americans, Trump regularly pushed untested treatments like ivermectin that almost certainly cost many, many American lives. What leaders do during moments like this actually matter a lot. Genuine, tangible effects that can be for the good or can really hurt people. And so yesterday, within hours of the attack in New Orleans, we didn't know much, right? President-elect Donald Trump falsely suggested the suspect was an undocumented immigrant or someone who had crossed over the border in some way. He was not. In fact, officials later identified the suspect as an American Army veteran, born and raised in the U.S. of A. But it was all very predictable, if enraging and dangerous. And even after we found out that this was an American, today Republicans continued, even though both the attacker in New Orleans and the Cybertruck driver in Las Vegas were not immigrants.
The congressional Republicans, we here in the House and the Senate, have repeatedly asked the DHS under the Biden administration about the correlation, the obvious concern about terrorism and the wide open border. The idea that dangerous people were coming here in droves and setting up potentially terrorist cells around the country.
I can't emphasize enough. Close the border, secure our sovereignty, and that is completely unacceptable. The entire world knows that we have an open border. They intend to hit us, and they are pushing people into our interior to do just that.
Wait. The guy was from Houston. Close the border so that Houston ends up on the other side of the border? How's that work? That immediate